Welcome, deep divers, to a profound journey into the very heart of human thought. Today we're diving into German idealism. It's a philosophical tradition centuries old, but it still, vibrates with urgency in our modern world.
It really does.
It's a way of thinking that profoundly shaped how we understand ourselves, our knowledge, our place in the cosmos, especially when we grapple with concepts like truth, morality, and, well, what it truly means to be human in an age so captivated by science.
That's right. And this isn't just dusty history we're talking about. Our mission today is really to explore the intricate ideas, the profound insights of German idealism as, well, a living, breathing source of debate.
Yep.
We'll try to untangle that enduring tension between idealism and its modern counterpart, naturalism. We'll unpack crucial concepts from giants like Kant, Fichte, Hegel.
Big names.
The big names, exactly. And we'll see how contemporary thinkers are re-engaging with these powerful ideas, often to challenge some of our most, deeply held assumptions.
And as we navigate these intellectual currents, here are some questions to keep at the forefront of your mind, because they really hit at the core of what we're discussing. Things like, how do we actually gain genuine knowledge about the world around us? Are our deepest values objective truths, or are they, entirely subjective creations of our minds?
That's a huge one.
It is. Can human freedom, that feeling of genuine choice, truly coexist with a natural world that seems governed by cause and effect?
The freedom versus determinism problem.
Yeah, and what role does our social life, our interactions with others play in shaping who we are and what we believe? So let's unpack this. Okay, so to truly grasp the significance of German idealism, we first need to understand the intellectual battlefield it entered.
Right, the context.
Yeah, context. Because for a long stretch of the 20th century, especially among English-speaking analytic philosophers, this entire tradition was largely sidelined, almost dismissed, really.
That's putting it mildly sometimes.
Yeah. We're talking about prominent figures like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, who actively rejected British idealism, which itself had strong Hegelian roots.
And that rejection really set the stage, didn't it, for a broader dismissal of all German idealism. And it's fascinating how specific and, at the time, seemingly devastating the criticisms were. Take Kant, for instance.
Okay, yeah. What was the issue with Kant?
Well, he was often accused of what critics called supernaturalist, or faculty psychological accounts of the mind. Meaning his ideas about how the mind works were seen as too speculative, relying on these abstract mental faculties rather than something, empirically verifiable, not scientific enough, basically.
Okay.
Then there was the charge of self-defeating skepticism. The classic example here is his concept of the thing in itself.
Ah, yes, the noumenon.
Right. If we can't truly know reality as it is independent of our minds, what can we really know at all? That was the worry.
A fair question, on the surface.
And his idea of the transcendental ideality of time and space, the notion that time and space aren't features of reality out there, but rather fundamental structures of our minds through which we experience reality, that was viewed as leading to extreme subjective idealism.
Sort of suggesting reality is just construct of our individual minds.
That was the accusation, yeah.
Yeah.
That it leads down that path.
So it sounds like critics felt Kant was already on shaky ground with these abstract concepts. But if Kant opened the door to complex idealism, many critics felt Hegel then took them to an even deeper abyss.
Oh, absolutely.
What were the specific accusations leveled against Hegel's philosophy that made him so, unpalatable to these analytic thinkers?
Well, with Hegel, the criticisms only intensified. He was often dismissed as a pre-critical metaphysician.
Meaning he was going backwards. Before Kant.
Kind of, implying his philosophy was seen as a retreat to speculative, uncritical thinking that Kant had supposedly overcome. His famous dialectics, that process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Which everyone sort of knows, vaguely.
Right, vaguely. That and his grand system were particularly scorned. The idea that a third determinate conclusion could somehow logically follow from the negation of two opposing ideas was viewed as, a complete non-starter.
Logically unsound, they thought?
Logically unsound, yeah. And the very ambition of creating a philosophical system capable of organizing a priori knowledge into a coherent and self-sufficient whole that was seen as problematically giving philosophy this privileged epistemic role.
Like philosophy gets the final say on everything.
Kind of an ultimate authority on knowledge, yeah. And many felt it simply didn't deserve that, especially compared to science.
And it wasn't just about logical rigor or metaphysical ambition, was it? There was a broader shared critique, too.
Yes. That both Kant and Hegel appeared to have little understanding and appreciation of the methods and achievements of mathematically based natural science. Their a priori totalizing philosophies of nature, these grand speculative systems about nature derived from pure reason, they just seem to clash directly with sober scientific research, which was making incredible empirical progress at the time.
You can see the tension there, philosophy spinning grand theories while science is actually discovering things.
That was the perception, absolutely. And this brings us squarely to the logical positivist era.
Okay, the Vienna Circle and all that.
Exactly. A powerful philosophical movement in the early 20th century that championed scientific rigor, empirical evidence, and often dismissed traditional metaphysics as, well, meaningless.
Strong stuff.
Very strong. For them, the very notion of synthetic a priori judgment, those statements Kant claimed were both necessarily true and informative about the world, like every event has a cause, yet not derived purely from experience, that was enough to reject both Kant and subsequent idealists.
Just that one concept.
It was a key sticking point. Logical positivists argued that only analytic judgments, statements true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried men, provide a priori knowledge.
Okay, true by definition.
Right. All other meaningful statements, synthetic judgments, had to be a posteriori, meaning grounded in experience, testable, verifiable.
So if you couldn't prove something true just by definition, it had to come from observation and scientific testing. This really enforced a strict division of labor, didn't it?
Precisely. Philosophy was told to restrict itself to conceptual clarification, essentially tidying up our language and logical frameworks.
The under-laborer, as Locke might say.
Something like that. Meanwhile, empirical science held the exclusive claim to genuine knowledge about the world. This intellectual framework really set philosophy on a very different, much more modest trajectory for decades.
Now, this neat division of labor, which seemed so settled for a while, began to fray at the edges, didn't it? What happened in the 1950s with Quine's impact that began to challenge this clear separation?
That's where it gets really interesting. Willard Van Orman Quine, his influential attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction in the 1950s, in his paper Two Dogmas of Empiricism, began to weaken the very basis for this division of labor.
How so?
Well, if that distinction wasn't as clear-cut as everyone had assumed, if maybe there aren't purely analytic truths separate from empirical ones, then philosophy's role became ambiguous again. The consequences were profound.
Okay.
Many philosophers started to give up the idea that their discipline had any unique claim to knowledge or rationality, ushering in naturalism as the preferred meta-philosophy.
A philosophy about how philosophy itself should be done.
Exactly. For many working in fields like philosophy of mind, epistemology, and for its most extreme proponents, known as radical ontological naturalism, natural science became the exclusive source of rational claims about nature, and the ultimate arbiter of what there is in a deep ontological sense.
So basically, if science can't measure it, it probably doesn't exist, or at least we can't know it.
That's the gist of the most radical versions, yes.
Yeah.
Science dictates ontology.
This sounds like a huge challenge, almost an existential crisis for philosophy itself. It's as if it's saying philosophy as a distinct discipline is essentially over, and its job is just to interpret science.
Indeed. This paradigm presented a considerable challenge to philosophy. It suggested that philosophers should primarily interpret the results of specific scientific theories and then apply those interpretations to traditional problems.
Like ethics or free will.
Exactly. So Darwinian evolution might inform views on the mind, morality, or action, with an emphasis always on law-like propositions aiming to provide causal explanations. Everything gets understood through a scientific causal lens.
But naturalism, for all its power, like any philosophical view, it seems to have its own Achilles heel. It can't seem to account for everything, leading to a kind of self-critique that, ironically, opens the door for idealism's resurgence. What exactly are its limitations?
That's a crucial point. A key critique of naturalism is its apparent inability to articulate normative commitments or even justify itself in a non-circular manner.
Okay, what do you mean by normative commitments?
Things like values, reasons, justification. Naturalism struggles to acknowledge normative notions such as truth, validity, and correctness. Why one argument is better than another, or why one statement is true rather than merely believed, or even to account for the very activity of applying concepts and making judgments. How does that fit into a purely causal physical picture? And perhaps most significantly, naturalism either squarely opposes or takes as metaphysical or pre-rational the view that human beings are agents who freely and responsibly relate to normative expectations and structures.
So it struggles with free will and responsibility.
Deeply. It often seeks to revise our everyday conceptual schemes, reducing concepts like thinking, willing, and feeling to what some call illusory folk psychology, implying they're just convenient fictions, not real features of the world.
So it can't quite explain why we strive for truth, why we make moral choices, or why we even believe in rationality itself, other than maybe as some kind of biological or neurological byproduct. It struggles to give meaning to these concepts.
You've hit on it. It has trouble grounding normativity.
And this, then, becomes a powerful battle cry against naturalism, explaining why German idealism is making a comeback.
Precisely. This anti-normative stance of naturalism is just fundamentally contrary to that of Kant and German idealism, which saw normativity concepts of should, ought, right, wrong, true, false as absolutely central. This explains the contemporary resurgence of this older tradition.
Right.
Thinkers like John McDowell, Robert Brandom, Hilary Putnam, they aren't dismissing science at all. Instead, they aim to show that while science is legitimate, scientism, the confusion of scientific claims with all philosophical claims, or the belief that science is the only valid form of knowledge, is not.
Making that distinction is key.
Crucial. They argue that purged of its speculative metaphysical aspirations, German idealism can actually show nature and freedom to be compatible, offering a way to understand both the scientific world and our experience of freedom and values without reducing one to the other.
This leads us to a fascinating distinction within naturalism itself: hard versus soft naturalism. Sebastian Gardner, a prominent philosopher we're drawing on, he's quite skeptical of these anti-metaphysical, or you could say deflationary, approaches to German idealism.
Yeah, the ones that try to make it more palatable to naturalists by downplaying its bolder claims.
Exactly. Gardner argues that these softened readings don't really stand up well against bald scientific naturalism when it comes to pure argument.
Gardner traces this analytic rejection of idealism back to the perceived superiority of logical analysis early on, and later, with figures like Quine, to the dominance of the scientific naturalistic worldview. He identifies the fundamental difficulty with naturalism as its rejection of values, or maybe not outright rejection, but their subordination to the ways in which human organisms respond to the requirements placed on them by the natural world.
So naturalism sees values as mere biological responses, adaptations, not as something inherently meaningful beyond survival or preference.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Reduced to biological function.
This is where soft naturalism tries to step in and rescue the situation, right? To make room for values without completely abandoning the naturalistic framework.
Yes, exactly. Soft naturalism, and you might think of Brandom and McDowell here again, attempts a rescue. They agree that speculative metaphysics is impossible. But because hard naturalism has kind of become the default position in many circles.
It has the momentum.
It has the momentum. So soft naturalism struggles to show that there are phenomena that have substantial reality, but do not owe it to the hard natural facts. Gardner suggests that if the debate between soft and hard naturalism gets framed as an appearance-reality contrast, is consciousness truly real, or just how it appears to us, the hard naturalist almost always wins. Because the hard naturalist simply asserts that only hard natural facts have substantial reality. Everything else is just appearance or epiphenomenal or reducible.
It's like they're playing on the hard naturalist's home turf and always struggling to score. So essentially, soft naturalism is caught in a bind. It wants to make room for values, consciousness, normativity.
All the difficult stuff.
All the difficult stuff. But without a strong, positive idealist framework, it struggles to explain why these things have a substantial reality beyond just hard science. It leaves them vulnerable to the hard naturalists who say, look, if it's not a hard fact, it's not truly real.
That's a huge philosophical hurdle for explaining human experience today. And Gardner then suggests maybe we shouldn't try to water down idealism. Maybe we should take German idealism's strong claims to being idealistic at face value.
Don't deflate them. Engage with them.
Engage with them seriously. For example, Hegel's concept of Geist, or spirit. Gardner suggests it should be seen as sui generis, of its own kind, and perhaps prior to nature, not merely arising from it as a complex natural phenomena.
Which implies a non-reducible realm of spirit or normativity, something distinct and foundational.
That's the implication. Soft naturalism, meanwhile, by accepting the scientific view of nature as intrinsically value indifferent, starts from a position where it has to constantly persuade us that it is not merely a negatively defined position, not hard naturalism, but something positively valuable in its own right.
So when soft naturalists show that a phenomenon like consciousness or a sense of right and wrong just can't be fully explained by purely physical facts, that's an important step.
It is, showing irreducibility.
But it's like discovering a mysterious object that doesn't fit into any of your existing categories. It tells you what it isn't, but it doesn't tell you what it is.
Right. Those irreducibility arguments, even if successful, they yield data, phenomena that do not interpret or explain themselves. They pose a question. The idealist, in contrast, Gardner argues, has a positive and contentful concept of the status to be accorded to phenomena that have been shown to be irreducible to the hard natural facts.
So idealism offers a positive framework, a place to put these irreducible things.
Whereas the soft naturalist lacks such an independently formed concept. Just referring vaguely to the natural order broadly conceived only raises the further difficulty of specifying the principle of unity of this order. How do the hard facts and the soft phenomena hang together in one nature?
Right. So soft naturalism faces this dilemma. It needs to provide some positive and contentful characterization of the natural order that somehow encompasses both scientific objects and those things hard naturalism excludes, like values or consciousness.
But it struggles to do that without becoming a non-naturalistic position under a misleading name. If it posits something fundamentally non-physical to unify everything, is it still naturalism?
Good question.
And it also has to explain why this supposedly unitary natural order exhibits such a split between the value-neutral physical and the value-laden normative or conscious.
To navigate this, soft naturalists often try a different tactic. They claim we don't need a deep, fundamental explanation of what truly exists, an ontological grounding, to justify phenomena like consciousness or values.
Instead, they say, these can be understood from a subjective point of view, or from a particular perspective, relative to which an internal perspectival reality can be claimed for these phenomena.
So consciousness is real for me, from my perspective.
Something like that. They hope to argue that the demand for further explanation beyond this subjective or perspectival level is ill-conceived, reflecting an illusion of unfilled explanatory space. Like, we feel there's more to explain, but actually there isn't. The perspectival account is enough. This reminds me of the arguments from the early 20th century philosopher Norman Kemp Smith. Our sources show he highlighted the great antagonism between idealism and naturalism as the heart of all philosophy. He really saw that as the central battle.
And he thought idealism had an edge.
He did, particularly because of values.
How so?
Kemp Smith observed that naturalism held that values have worth only by reference to the detailed contingencies of terrestrial existence. They're just about our survival or preferences here on Earth. Idealism, however, is compatible with the claim for their absoluteness, that values can have intrinsic universal worth, independent of our situation.
A much stronger claim for value.
Much stronger. And he argued that naturalists often take a sideways-on view of values. They approach them through their natural and economic setting, or through animal behavior, and the result, he claimed, is that they do not study them at all.
Meaning they study the mechanisms of valuing maybe the evolutionary origins, but not the values themselves as we experience them.
Exactly. They study the container, not the content. Kemp Smith believed that a non-sideways-on view, one that looks directly at the experience of valuing, sees values as absolute, as beyond all natural contingency. It's a powerful point.
It is. This really cuts to the core of the entire debate. How do you, listening now, weigh the claims of scientific explanation against the seemingly non-reducible nature of human values and experience? It's a question that truly gets at the heart of this entire debate we're unpacking. Okay, so to understand the dynamism of German idealism, we really have to start with its foundation. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy, specifically his ingenious response to that deep-seated philosophical challenge, skepticism. How do we know anything for sure?
Okay, let's unpack this. Kant recognized that certain fundamental principles, think of things like everything that happens has its cause, or basic principles of math, cannot be justified by natural science alone.
You don't discover causation in a lab test tube.
Right. These aren't empirical observations you derive from experiments. Instead, Kant argued these principles play a special epistemic role. They actually constitute the very possibility of epistemic practices, including natural science.
Wow. So they're the preconditions for science.
That's the idea. Without them, he claimed, there would be no epistemic practices at all.
Cool.
This forms the basis of transcendental philosophy and asks, what are the necessary conditions for the very possibility of experience and knowledge itself?
So he wasn't just observing how we know things, but asking what has to be true about our minds and the world for us to know anything at all. That's a deep question.
Very deep. And he saw logic as a kind of model for achieving scientific status, because in logic, the understanding must deal only with its own form, which it can know a priori. It's self-contained.
Okay.
And this became the model for explaining these tricky synthetic a priori principles. In mathematics, our experience of the world, and even morality. In each case, Kant argued, knowledge of the a priori is knowledge of the forms of our own faculties. We know them because they're structures of our own minds.
And the concept of the synthetic a priori is absolutely crucial here, isn't it?
Fundamental. These are judgments that are both necessarily true, a priori, meaning they don't come from experience, and yet they're informative about the world.
Like every event has a cause. It tells us something about how the world works, but we don't learn it just by observing lots of events.
Exactly. For Kant, these are not derived from experience, but are conditions for experience. They structure how we apprehend reality. Without these innate structures, our experience would just be a chaotic, meaningless blur, what he called a blooming, buzzing confusion, borrowing from William James later.
But not everyone was convinced, right? Salomon Maimon, an early post-Kantian philosopher, offered a skeptical edge that, ironically, pushed German idealism even further. Expert, how did Maimon challenge Kant's ideas, creating this serpent's bite that still echoes today?
Maimon is a fascinating figure. He believed Kant fundamentally misinterprets Hume and consequently underestimates the challenge of methodological naturalism.
So he thought Kant didn't fully grapple with Hume's skepticism.
That's right. Hume, according to Maimon, didn't deny the concept of cause in everyday life, but doubted its objective reality. Hume suggested our belief in causation comes from association of ideas and custom, basically habit. We confuse what's merely subjective and comparatively universal, what we always happen to see, with the objectively and absolutely universal, what must be the case.
So just because we always see A followed by B doesn't mean A causes B in some objective, necessary way. It's just a habit of our minds.
That was Hume's challenge, and Maimon felt Kant hadn't fully answered it. Maimon posited this continued standoff between transcendental philosophy and methodological naturalism. He used this really evocative metaphor.
The serpent's bite.
The serpent's bite, yes. The critical philosopher Kant will always disturb the skeptical philosopher Hume with the necessity and universality of principles required for scientific knowledge. But you, serpent, will bite him on the heel. That is, the skeptic will always tease the critical philosopher with the fact that his necessary and universal principles have no use.
That's quite a sting. It's like building this magnificent, perfectly engineered bridge of theory, only for someone to point out it leads straight into a brick wall. All that elegant thought, but what's its practical application in explaining the messy world we live in if we can't be sure it objectively applies? It's a challenge that still resonates.
It absolutely does.
And our sources draw an analogy between Maimon's challenge to Kant and Quine's later critique of Carnap, with Paul Frank specifically calling Quine a post-Kantian Maimonian.
You've really captured the tension there. And what's fascinating is that parallel. Carnap, in a crucial sense post-Kantian, saw logic as entirely formal, constituted by analytic propositions that express meanings and are objects of a priori knowledge. Very Kantian in spirit.
Okay.
And Quine, much like Maimon before him, throws a wrench in the works. His indeterminacy of translation thesis is seen as a striking radicalization of Maimon's response. Quine essentially gave a naturalistic account of the usage and an anti-realist account of the constitutive functions of all concepts.
Meaning concepts just become about how we use them, no deeper reality?
Pretty much. It reduces concepts to their practical naturalistic usage within a web of beliefs, rather than grounding them in some objective a priori structure or reality. So the fundamental challenge remains. Franks argues that the methodological naturalist and the methodological non-naturalist cannot avoid begging the question against each other.
How so?
One side claims methodological conservatism, sticking to established scientific methods, and the other side claims content conservatism, insisting on non-naturalistic explanations for certain types of content, like values or consciousness. They start from different fundamental assumptions. This old enmity between human heels and serpentine fangs persists.
So how did the core German idealists themselves respond to this persisting standoff, this challenge from Maimon and naturalism's bite? They couldn't just throw up their hands and give up.
No, they definitely didn't. One early post-Kantian response, sort of anticipating later moves, was to try and revise both Hume's and Kant's conceptions of naturalistic methodology. This involved seeking disciplines like anthropology or psychology that are methodologically distinct from physics, but which nevertheless counts as an equally legitimate science. Trying to find a scientific way to study the mind and human experience that wasn't just physics.
Like a human science.
A human science, exactly. So some early post-Kantians, like Jacob Friedrich Fries, tried to find a middle ground. He thought, okay, Kant's onto something with the transcendental, but maybe we don't need a whole new a priori method to study it.
What was his alternative?
He wondered if we could perhaps naturalize what was worth preserving in transcendental philosophy without incurring any skeptical consequences, maybe through psychology, by studying the facts of consciousness. Fries actually called Kant's assumption of a distinct transcendentalist method a transcendental prejudice, arguing Kant's inferential deductions of synthetic a priori principles lead to a logical circle in the proofs.
So ground philosophy and empirical psychology instead of pure reason.
That was Fries's idea, yes. And it echoes some contemporary hopes for cognitive psychology today. Can science explain the structures Kant talked about?
But the core German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, they weren't content with this facts of consciousness approach. They went for a much more ambitious alternative, didn't they?
Indeed. Fries's approach was anathema to the German idealists. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel sought a more direct and frankly more radical approach to understand nature in general as the incarnation of reason.
Whoa, nature as the embodiment of reason.
That's the audacious claim. For them, reason wasn't just a human faculty or a system of logic. It was something embodied in the very fabric of reality itself. However, even Fichte had his limitations initially. He derived constitutive principles for organic and inorganic nature, but only insofar as the natural world is assumed to provide the background and the instruments for rational action.
So nature was still just a stage for human reason.
For Fichte, initially, yes, he believed only the human world, not the natural world, could be said to incarnate reason. This still left the naturalistic serpent biting the transcendental philosopher's heel when it came to explaining rational agency itself, as naturalistic thinking still seemed fundamentally unaccommodating to it.
This is where Schelling and Hegel step in with their truly ambitious vision. It sounds like they wanted to bridge that gap completely.
You're right. They sought to understand nature as petrified intelligence, a phrase Hegel actually attributed to Schelling.
Petrified intelligence, like reason frozen into matter.
It's a striking image, isn't it? It implies that no natural scientific explanation is adequate unless it can be placed within a framework that renders rational agency intelligible.
So science describes how nature works, but it can only truly explain it if that explanation ultimately makes sense within a framework where human reason and agency are possible, not just weird anomalies.
That's the core idea. This perspective is aptly characterized as forms of realism about ideas, meaning ideas aren't just in our heads, but have a real structuring presence in the world.
And Schelling and Hegel had slightly different programs for achieving this.
Yes. Schelling's program was maximally ambitious, to literally reform natural science itself, showing it performs better if it employs concepts of proto-rationality to explain how first nature gives rise to second nature, how basic natural processes organically lead to more complex, even rational ones.
Wow, change science itself.
Hegel's program was perhaps more modest, but still incredibly profound. Employed distinctively philosophical methods to interpret the results of natural science as contributions to an account of the proto-rationality of nature, and hence of the naturalness of reason. Interpret science philosophically to show nature's inherent leaning towards rationality.
And both approaches, of course, would require showing that it is impossible to take an anti-realist attitude to proto-rationality, that you can't just deny this kind of inherent developing rationality in nature.
That's the philosophical heavy lifting required, yes.
This is a huge shift in perspective. It really makes me wonder, and maybe you too, where do you draw the line between scientific explanation and philosophical interpretation of reality, particularly when it comes to consciousness, values, or purpose? Is there a point where science hands off to philosophy, or are they perhaps always intertwined in our search for understanding? Now, let's zoom in on how these idealist insights shaped our understanding of the self and our place in society. We can start with Fichte's groundbreaking ideas on the genesis of self-consciousness. He argues for an intersubjective constitution of individuality, which sounds complex.
It does, but the core idea is powerful.
It essentially means our individual self, our sense of I, is fundamentally shaped by our interactions with others.
It's a profound claim. What's fascinating here is Fichte's assertion that actual self-consciousness, one's empirical awareness of oneself as a self-determining subject, is only possible if one is brought to self-consciousness. He famously states, persons are made, not born.
Made, not born. That's striking.
It is. This means individuals are determined by other individuals to become an individual. It highlights that our very sense of self, our unique individuality, isn't something you're just born with, like blue eyes. It's something built entirely through how others recognize you, interact with you, and crucially, challenge you into freedom.
And central to this process is what Fichte calls the summons, an Aufforderung. It's an act of being determined by another, by which I am called to freedom by the other. How does this summons work? It sounds a bit abstract.
It can seem that way, but think of it practically. The summons is an ideal process of socialization, targeted on a child acquiring a minimum conception of individuality. It's not merely a stimulus response, like, a mother smiling just to get a baby to smile back.
There's more to it?
Much more. Its deeper purpose is to awaken the child to its own freedom and self-activity. It acts as a feature or structural aspect of agent-other interactions. These expectations, realized through summons-type interactions, establish what Fichte called proto-rights.
Proto-rights, like basic expectations.
Kind of. Normative structures that aren't explicitly moral laws, but must be operative wherever human beings live together. Think of it like this. When a parent tells a child no, it's not just a command, it's also a subtle acknowledgement of the child's potential agency, their capacity to choose not to do something. The summons calls forth that capacity for free action.
What's also crucial to Fichte's thought here is the necessity of embodiment for this self-conscious agency to even be possible. It's not just about abstract thought in some disembodied mind.
Absolutely. Fichte profoundly connects self-conscious agency with our physical being, our bodies. He argues that these socialization processes, the ones involving summons-type structures, they precipitate the emergence of what the neophyte experiences as boundaries or borders or limits concerning what is and what is not under her immediate control.
Learning what's me and not me.
And what I can control. The awareness of having the power to say no as a choice requires an awareness of being entitled to say no, which is tied to controlling one's own sphere, primarily the body.
So the body is the sphere of freedom.
Our body, through basic actions where an individual consciously controls their movements, becomes the minimum necessary sphere making freedom possible. This requires the individual to be free to move her body through some large subset of the indefinite range of possibilities that its articulated character permits. Our ability to move freely is fundamental.
And this body isn't just a biological object.
No, for Fichte, the human body is a reciprocal concept. It's intersubjectively constituted by being treated by others as having sense, as responding to summons. The recognition of another mind, he argues, is intrinsically tied to the recognition of a certain kind of body. We see the mind in the body's expressions, its potential for free action.
This leads Fichte to some pretty profound conclusions about indeterminacy and equality. He points out that humans, unlike animals perhaps, lack a determinate set of law-governed action routines. We're not pre-programmed.
Exactly. This human prematurity, as you could call it, means the human body cannot be comprehended through any determinate concept at all. It must be capable of all conceivable movements ad infinitum.
Unlike an animal whose body might be perfectly adapted for one thing.
Right. Think of a bird's wings for flight. Very determinate. The human body, in contrast, is only intimated and projected, open to realizing conceptualized possibilities of acting. From writing poetry to building a skyscraper, countless possibilities.
And from this very indeterminacy, Fichte derives equality. How does that work?
It's a fascinating move, because the human body is a vehicle for indefinite possibilities of action. And because no definite concept which is appropriate for the grasping of such a body, we are therefore inwardly compelled to regard every other human being as his equal.
Why compelled?
Because encountering another human body is to encounter something that perpetually outruns one's capacity to make it conceptually determinate as the vehicle of human doings. We can never fully grasp or define another person's potential, and thus, in its fundamental likeness to us, in this very conceptual indeterminacy, it reveals our equality. We recognize in others the same open-ended potential that we find in ourselves.
That's a powerful grounding for equality. Okay, moving from Fichte, we arrive at Hegel, whose dialectic of spirit, freedom, and ethical life provides an even more expansive vision of the self and society. And central to understanding Hegel is his concept of spirit, or Geist, and its relationship to nature. Sounds like he makes a pretty bold claim about its priority over nature.
He makes a very strong claim, one that fundamentally challenges any deflationary views that try to see spirit merely arising from nature as some later complex product. Hegel states, quite poetically, nature is the first in point of time, but the absolute prius is the idea. This absolute prius is the last, the true beginning. Alpha is omega.
Alpha is omega. The end is the beginning.
Exactly. He further asserts, spirit has thus proceeded from nature. But it is one-sided to regard spirit in this way as having only become an actual existence after being merely a potentiality.
Yeah.
Spirit, just because it is the goal of nature, is prior to it. Nature has proceeded from spirit.
So spirit, or the idea, is ontologically prior, the deeper reality, the ultimate ground of nature, not just a temporal product of it.
That's the clear implication. It's a radical inversion of the usual materialist or naturalist picture.
So if we interpret spirit, or this conceptual order, as having this ultimate, fundamental, comprehensive, explanatory position, it's really an ontological claim about what truly exists at the deepest level, isn't it? Not just a conceptual one.
That's the point Gardner makes.
It's not just a way we think about reality. It is reality's deepest structure, according to Hegel.
Precisely. Deflationary interpretations, the ones trying to make Hegel acceptable to naturalists, they attempt to respect idealism's claim to absoluteness without ontologizing it. They insist on a distinction between the conceptual and the ontological.
Keep them separate.
But as the argument goes, if the conceptual order has ultimate, fundamental, comprehensive, explanatory position, then plausibly it is no longer conceptual as opposed to ontological. If thought is truly foundational, that is an ontological claim.
You can't have it both ways.
It seems difficult. There's a risk, the critique suggests, of confusing transcendental and empirical distinctions of nature from norm. To see the transcendental self-institution of normativity as such out of nature as metaphysically innocuous, like saying society invents money, which is just a convention, is a mistake.
By a mistake.
Because the emergence of normativity, for Hegel, impinges on our conception of the natural world and the realm of concepts as two distinct orders. It implies normativity isn't just a human convention superimposed on nature, but reflects a deep feature of how reality itself is structured, a structure that includes both nature and spirit.
Okay, Hegel also gave us a profound understanding of the sociality of reason and a critique of what he saw as abstract, isolated autonomy. He believed we always already find ourselves in practices informed by norms, which he called a form of life, or shape of spirit.
Yes, Lebensform or Gestaltegeist.
Yeah.
These forms of life are structured around a set of normative convictions, shared understandings of what's good, right, true, that are usually inarticulate and immediate, ready to hand.
Like common sense or cultural intuition.
Exactly. This tacit knowledge, the unstated rules and expectations of our culture, our community, guides our actions and aspirations. This makes reason inherently social for Hegel, not something a lone individual constructs in a vacuum.
And from this social view, he critiques Kantian autonomy, the idea of self-legislation.
He does. Kant's autonomy states that the will is not merely subject to the law, but is so subject that it must be considered as also giving the law to itself, implying freedom is self-legislation. We are only bound by laws we give ourselves.
Which sounds very empowering.
It does. But Hegel sees a problem. It leads to what's often called the Kantian paradox.
Where freedom seems to eat itself. How does that work again?
The paradox is this. I can only be obligated by a law of which I can regard myself as the author. Okay, fine. But if I create the law arbitrarily, just based on my whim, it's non-binding. It has no real authority over me or others.
Right, just making stuff up isn't law.
But if there's some non-self-legislated external law or reason that compels me to will this specific law, then it wouldn't be truly obligatory in the Kantian sense, because I didn't freely self-legislate it. I was forced.
So either it's arbitrary and non-binding, or it's determined and not freely self-legislated.
It seems to lead to a kind of bind or even self-contradictory options, where the very act of pure individual self-legislation seems to undermine either its authority or its freedom.
That sounds like a philosophical Gordian knot. How does Hegel cut through this, moving beyond what he saw as a kind of self-sufficiency fantasy of the individual?
For Hegel, the solution lies in recognizing the social and historical nature of the self. The liberal individual, he argues, is a historical achievement, not a transcendental condition of agency. The idea of a completely self-sufficient, independent individual making laws out of pure reason is at best a partial view, and at worst a misguided fantasy of personal independence.
So the starting point is wrong.
The starting point of the isolated individual is wrong. Hegel insists that my willing is always and already possible only by virtue of my relation to others. If my own subjectivity is possible only by virtue of intersubjective relations, then this fantasy of complete individual autonomy just falls apart.
So where does moral authority come from then, if not pure self-legislation?
For Hegel, the truth of authority, even the authority claimed by individual conscience, is to be found not within, but in the concrete conditions of social dependence. Ethical life, or Sittlichkeit, the customs, institutions, and shared understandings of a community, starting with the family, provides this mediated authority. It contrasts sharply with the purely inner authority claimed by conscience that Kant seemed to emphasize.
This leads him to a critique of what he calls the beautiful soul and the limits of conscience. It's not enough to simply feel pure in your intentions, is it?
Exactly. The beautiful soul, in Hegel's critique, characterizes a kind of romanticized Fichtean moral position where individual conscience is seen as an infallible supreme judge.
My conscience is my guide, period.
Right. This leads such figures to revere their inner infinitude, effectively making themselves, their ego, God. They retreat into the purity of their own intentions, believing their subjective moral judgment is absolute and condemning the messy compromises of the real world.
But there's a problem with that stance.
A big one. The problem is not just potential misrecognition or hypocrisy, but real antitheses between particularly embodied and individuated agents and the purported universality of the intentions upon which they claim to act. The beautiful soul must acknowledge the evil that is irreducibly attendant on its necessary moment of singularity and difference from others. That our individual actions, however well-intentioned, inevitably exist in a world with other individuals, and can have unintended, even negative consequences when they clash with the actions and perspectives of others. You can't escape the complexities of interaction.
So it's not enough to simply feel pure in your intentions. Your actions in the world, in relation to others, have real consequences and complexities that an isolated conscience can't fully account for or judge.
Precisely. The process for Hegel, famously depicted in the phenomenology of spirit, culminates not in judgment, but in mutual confession and forgiveness. A reconciling yea where the two I's let go their antithetical existence. This achievement of reciprocal recognition is for Hegel the absolute spirit and the presence of the divine in the world, not nature itself, but this intersubjective reconciliation.
Wow. That's a very different picture of spirit.
Very different. And it leads Hegel to say morality is fundamentally concerned with one's being, we might say, who one must be, rather than one's doing what one ought to do. It reflects claims about the goodness of the expressed will, the character embedded in a community beyond just the abstract rightness of individual acts considered in isolation.
This all ties into Hegel's famous concept of the cunning of reason, where history seems to operate behind our backs. What exactly does he mean by that? It sounds a bit conspiratorial.
It can sound that way. The cunning of reason, Lister Vernunft, describes how unintentional individual agency, people pursuing their own passions, interests, goals, nevertheless contributes to a larger rational development in history. It's like individuals pursue their own ends, maybe selfishly, maybe not, but through their collective actions, a larger, more rational historical process unfolds, almost as if reason itself is using their passions as instruments to achieve its own ends.
So we're puppets of reason.
Not quite puppets. Hegel doesn't mean individuals are bereft of freedom. Rather, it's more about a dawning awareness of one's newly increased reflective capacity relative to society. As history progresses, we become more aware of the rational structures underlying our social world, and Hegel argues that reason itself must develop by being historically instantiated in various cultural shapes, with each historical form of life discovering and correcting inadequacies in its conception of reason and freedom.
So reason itself evolves through history.
Yes, that's a key Hegelian idea. This, in turn, requires a strong structural principle that guarantees a stepwise isomorphism between thought and world, a kind of profound alignment or parallel development between how we think, our concepts of reason and freedom, and how reality, particularly social reality, is structured.
It's a truly complex and deep idea. It makes me reflect, and maybe you too. How much of your self-identity and moral framework do you believe is truly individual, stemming purely from your own conscience or reason, and how much is shaped, perhaps invisibly, by the social and historical context you inhabit? It's a question that truly gets at the heart of the idealist project, especially Hegel's. #4. Contemporary re-engagements and methodological debates. It's clear that these profound ideas from German idealism haven't simply gathered dust in libraries. In fact, contemporary philosophy has seen a remarkable re-engagement with these thinkers, particularly within what's often called the Pittsburgh School, with figures like John McDowell and Robert Brandom returning to Hegel, especially at the intersection of mind and epistemology.
That's right, a real Hegelian renaissance in certain analytic circles.
So what does Brandom's inferentialism, for instance, reveal about how we understand concepts, drawing on Hegel?
Brandom's inferentialism is quite insightful and explicitly draws inspiration from Hegel. He argues that concepts are inferentially articulated. What that means is their content isn't just a simple definition you look up. It's defined by the role they play in inferences, what you can conclude from applying the concept, and what conditions entitle you to apply it.
So meaning is defined by its use in reasoning.
Exactly. He sees formal rules of inference, like those in logic, as ultimately reconstructions of the ways in which these rules operate pragmatically in everyday speech, in our social practice of giving and asking for reasons. So to truly grasp a concept like justice or electron isn't just to know its dictionary definition, but to have practical mastery over its inferences, knowing what follows from its applicability and what it follows from within our shared language and practice.
But not everyone agrees with Brandom's interpretation of Hegel. Stephen Holgate, for example, offers a critique. He argues that while Brandom's inferentialism shares similarities with Hegel's view, there are fundamental differences, right?
Holgate does raise important questions. He contends that while Hegel certainly agrees concepts are inferentially articulated, Hegel would not see the pragmatics of speech as fundamental and self-sufficient, as Brandom seems to.
What's fundamental for Hegel, then?
For Hegel, according to Holgate, the a priori concepts and categories explored in Hegel's logic, concepts like being, nothing, becoming, quality, quantity, are what make linguistic activity and intelligibility possible in the first place. Hegel's logic, in this view, uncovers the basic concepts and categories that structure thinking and linguistic activity before we even get to everyday speech and social pragmatics. These are foundational logical structures, not just derived from how we happen to talk.
So pragmatics rests on logic, not the other way around.
That's Holgate's reading of Hegel, yes.
Yeah. Robert Pippin, another key interpreter, also offers a critique of Brandom, describing Brandom's approach as having a phenomenalist limit. That sounds critical. What does Pippin mean by that, and why is it a problem from a Hegelian perspective?
Pippin argues that Brandom's social pragmatist inferentialist holism, this idea that concepts and norms are defined by their use in a social game of giving and asking for reasons, can end up being indistinguishable from a kind of inferentialist positivism.
Positivism meaning just describing what happens.
Exactly. Pippin suggests that while Brandom can explain very well how participants play the normative game of giving and asking for reasons, he ultimately avoids the crucial question of the putative merits of challenges in general. He describes what happens when challenges occur, how norms are negotiated, but leaves the judgment of their ultimate validity or rationality purely to the participants themselves within their social practice.
So it lacks a critical edge.
Pippin thinks so. For Hegel, a central problem was what he called positivity, the situation where you have the successful administration of what appear to be norms, but they are somehow missing some crucial element which would distinguish alienated from a truly affirmative, self-imposed relation to the law. Think of unjust laws that are nevertheless effectively enforced. Brandom's account, in Pippin's view, remains too formalist. It describes the game, but doesn't adequately track whether the society playing the game is getting any better at distinguishing genuine, rational claims to authority from merely putative, perhaps power-based claims.
He offers a vivid example to illustrate this, doesn't he? Something called the Queen's Shilling. Can you explain that?
Yes, it's a powerful example. Pippin recounts the 18th century British practice where accepting a shilling from a naval recruiting officer meant you were deemed to have enlisted in the Navy, even if you were, say, tricked while drunk and didn't understand the significance of taking the coin.
Right, a coerced or ignorant commitment.
Brandom, describing this purely formally, might say something like, those who accepted found out the significance of what they had done only upon awakening from the resulting stupor. Just describing the social attribution.
But that misses the injustice.
That's Pippin's point. He counters. Most of us would say intuitively that the fact that others attributed such a commitment to an individual did not mean that that individual was, in normative fact, truly so committed, that the practice counted something as a commitment illegitimately. Brandam's descriptive model struggles to capture this normative failure.
So Brandam misses the critical dimension.
Pippin argues it highlights what Brandam's ongoing negotiations model misses. Hegel's focus on the Kampf, the often difficult fight or struggle for recognition, which is fundamentally a struggle to determine how we make distinctions between objective, rational claims and merely subjective or power-based ones. It involves establishing the proper distinction between the fact of power and the fact of reason. It's about more than just describing social negotiation. It's about the substantive rationality and justice of the norms being negotiated.
So Pippin ultimately reads Hegel quite differently. More as a constructivist, meaning norms and values are constructed, not discovered out there.
That's right. Pippin interprets Hegel as essentially a continuation and development of Kant's constructivist and anti-realist turn in ethics. For Kant, remember, norms and values are not out there in the world independently of our active determination, but are based on the structure of rational will.
Okay.
Pippin argues Hegel takes this Kantian idea and applies it socially, making legislation and norm creation a matter of a collective subject or Geist, a collective spirit expressed in institutions and practices, rather than just an individual rational agent. He sees Hegel as resolving Kant's paradox about how self-legislation can constitute a viable and coherent source of ethical values by adding this crucial social and developmental dimension. Norms are constructed, but socially and historically, not individually and timelessly.
But this constructivist reading faces its own challenges, doesn't it? Critics like Charles Larmor raise an important question.
Yes, the grounding problem for constructivism, Larmor asks, if nothing prior to the act of legislation that is itself normative, then how are any responsible or rational lawmaking decisions to be made? If there are no pre-existing values or reasons guiding the construction process, doesn't the construction become arbitrary?
Like pulling norms out of thin air.
That's the worry. It raises the question of reasons for constructing norms one way rather than another, suggesting that perhaps some reasons or values must obtain prior to the process to guide it rationally. It's a persistent challenge for purely constructivist views.
Another key contemporary figure engaging with German idealism, especially Hegel, is Jürgen Habermas, with his concept of detranscendentalization. That sounds like quite a mouthful. What's he trying to do?
Habermas essentially wants to keep the useful social and communicative insights of idealism while stripping away what he sees as its more abstract, metaphysical, or philosophy of consciousness elements. He famously distinguishes between an earlier, good Hegel from his Jenner writings.
The young Hegel.
The young Hegel, yeah. Who Habermas believes worked towards a communicative and intersubjectivist theory of the formation of the human mind, where spirit is basically understood as socially instituted structures of mutual recognition, very focused on interaction.
Okay, that sounds quite modern.
It does. Habermas contrasts this good Hegel with a later bad Hegel from the Phenomenology and beyond, who supposedly abandoned this intersubjective focus and replaced it with a theory of absolute subjectivity involving a totalizing, otherness-absorbing, self-conscious whole, a kind of metaphysical monster in Habermas's view.
So Habermas wants the social insights without the grand metaphysics, and he attempts to reclaim Kant in a similar way through what he calls formal pragmatics. How does he try to do that?
Exactly. He seeks a return to motives found in Kant, but grounding them in language and communication, not transcendental consciousness. He looks for paradigm-neutral types of self-reflection, embedded in language use itself. His formal pragmatics aims to reconstruct the pragmatic presuppositions speakers allegedly must make when engaging in action oriented towards understanding.
What kind of presuppositions?
Things like assuming your conversation partner is rational, sincere, speaks comprehensibly. This includes certain idealizations or discourse rules, which stipulate, for instance, that in an ideal speech situation, participants are free and equal, have the same chance to put forward or call into question claims, and are free from distorting influences like power or coercion.
So the rules for good conversation become the basis for rationality.
That's the core idea. Engaging in communication aimed at understanding, Habermas argues, commits us implicitly to understanding others as potentially rational subjects, freely capable of advancing or rejecting various claims. For Habermas, these rules of ideal communication are the true, detranscendentalized foundation of rationality and normativity.
But Habermas's interpretation of Kant and Hegel isn't without its critics either, particularly regarding his charge of mentalism, that they focus too much on internal mental states, on consciousness.
Right. Critics argue Habermas tends to lump Kant and his version of the bad Hegel together with Descartes and what he calls mentalism, or the philosophy of the subject. He assumes they presuppose a robust realism according to which the world to be correctly represented is the world as it is independently of a subject's conceptual determination of it.
So Habermas thinks they believe there's a world out there, and our minds just try to mirror it.
That's the picture Habermas paints. However, critics argue this misrepresents both Kant and Hegel. They claim neither Kant nor Hegel believe A, that there is such a thing as a world in itself to be represented at all in that naive way, or B, that the most promising way to reconstruct the conditions under which knowledge is possible is to try to identify an immediately given mental state.
So what was Kant's concern, if not mirroring?
Kant's real concern, these critics argue, is not representation itself, but the uncovering of the conditions our representations must conform to in order for human agents to be able to take them as representing objects in the first place. What makes objective judgment possible.
And Hegel.
And Hegel, in the Phenomenology, while accepting that judging presupposes a pre-giving commitment to specific norms, rejects the idea of a fixed and transhistorical set of forms of judgment, like Habermas's discourse rules. Instead, for Hegel, it's a dynamic historical process, a progressive testing of successive candidates for successful notional determination of judgment, where inadequate forms of understanding lead to conflict and paradox, prompting new, more adequate ones to emerge. The ultimate implicit basis isn't abstract rules, but a concrete community of agents in which every member is recognized by the others as free and equal.
Now let's turn to the ongoing methodological debates surrounding the interpretation of German idealism itself. This isn't just about what the texts say, but how we should approach them, which profoundly impacts what we get out of them. Friedrich Beiser, for instance, critiques what he calls the analytic method of interpretation.
Yes, Beiser is a strong voice for a different approach. He argues that the analytic method, which he sees practiced by figures like Peter Strawson, Jonathan Bennett, but also contemporary interpreters like Robert Pippin and Terry Pinkard, radically misrepresents the nature of German idealism.
How so?
By effectively sanitizing and purging it of its metaphysical commitments to make it fit modern sensibilities. This method, he explains, often restricts interpreters to rationally reconstructing the arguments he detects in accordance with the standards of argumentation and basic ontological commitments of today's analytic philosophy.
So judging them by our standards, not theirs.
Exactly. The consequence, Beiser warns, is that such readings become anachronistic, tailored to contemporary philosophical fashions, and thus potentially limiting. They prevent us from broadening our horizons by truly engaging with the original, often challenging and perhaps alien claims of these historical figures. We make them sound too much like us.
So he's saying we're making these historical thinkers conform to our modern preconceptions rather than letting them truly challenge us. He advocates for a historicist approach instead. What does that involve?
Exactly. The historicist tradition, to which Beiser aligns himself, demands rigorous scrutiny of the historical figure's intention and historical context. To know why Hegel or Kant made certain claims, we need to individuate him as an author and show how he responds to particular issues and questions that arise in his own cultural and historical context. Understand their problems, their assumptions, their world.
So the goal is to understand them on their own terms first.
Yes, this allows us to learn from how they differed from us, rather than just seeing ourselves reflected back in a distorted historical mirror. It's like, as you said before, listening to someone from a different culture. You can try to translate everything into your own terms immediately, or you can try to understand their worldview on its own terms first, even if it seems strange.
This raises a very interesting reflective question for all of us listening. How do you approach understanding ideas from different times or cultures? Do you try to translate them into your current understanding right away, or do you try to immerse yourself in their original context first? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each method? It's a live issue in interpreting philosophy.
And finally, a less discussed but potentially crucial aspect of idealism's legacy, particularly in contemporary re-engagements, is the role of art and expressive practices. Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, famously argued that traditional epistemology focused on representation in terms of the relationship between mind and world no longer deserved center stage.
He thought philosophy's obsession with mirroring reality was a dead end.
Pretty much. He thought its end should spell the end of philosophy as we know it as well, a radical conclusion.
But Richard Eldridge offers a different path, proposing that philosophy should be transformed along lines staked out by such figures as Aristotle, Hegel, and Wittgenstein. So, not the end of philosophy, but a new beginning, perhaps, focused differently.
Precisely. Instead of focusing narrowly on mind-world representation, Eldridge suggests philosophy should focus on the ways in which human agents position themselves within a community of speakers, within shared practices.
How does that work?
He posits that every judgment is an act of normatively structured positioning. When we make a judgment, we take a stand, we commit ourselves according to rules. This presupposes spontaneity, the act of freely determining something as something in accordance with rules for which one carries a degree of responsibility.
And where does art fit in?
Eldridge suggests that art is capable of holding this play up before us. Art, in its various forms, dramatizes the ineradicable human tension between freedom and givenness, autonomy and heteronomy. It shows us that constant push and pull between our freedom to create meaning and shape the world and the given world, the traditions, the materials we find ourselves working with.
That connects back nicely to the insights of early German Romanticism, doesn't it? They held that if the highest, the absolute, is ultimately not accessible to reflection, to concepts,
then only art can reveal this inaccessibility as such in the inexhaustible content of an aesthetic work. Art points beyond the limits of concepts.
Schelling had ideas along these lines too.
Yes. For Schelling, the deep subjectivity or productivity of nature cannot be fully captured conceptually. We only conceptualize its products, the appearing natural world, not the underlying creative productivity that he believed was common to both mind and matter. Art, for Schelling, as a concrete manifestation of human freedom emerging from this productivity, similarly cannot be conclusively interpreted or reduced to conceptual determination. It always has more meaning than we can articulate.
And music, for Schleiermacher.
Schleiermacher, another key figure of the era, contrasted language, which captures articulated thought, with music. Music, he suggested, represents the whole manifold of movements of self-consciousness, to the extent that they are not ideas but real states of life. Felt experience, emotion, dynamism. This highlights expressive practices that cannot be wholly grasped in terms of the normative assessments required for cognitive and ethical judgment. Some aspects of human experience just transcend purely conceptual or linguistic capture.
So some aspects of human experience just transcend purely conceptual or linguistic capture. Theodor Adorno, another key figure, deeply influenced by Hegel, offers a complex dialectical view of reason and nature in this context.
Adorno states, in a typically dense phrase, that emerging in an ephemeral manner from nature, reason is identical and non-identical with nature.
Okay, identical and non-identical, how?
He argues that we are really no longer ourselves a piece of nature at the moment when we recognize that we are a piece of nature. Our ability to reflect on our natural origins takes us, in a sense, beyond being merely natural.
Reason lifts us out of nature, partly.
Partly. But Adorno warns, modernity sees rationality become natural again in the form of instrumental reasoning. Reason gets reduced to a tool for calculation and control, losing its critical reflective power and becoming just another force within nature, serving predetermined ends. This creates a complex, fraught relationship where reason and nature cannot be decisively separated.
And this has social implications for Adorno.
Huge implications. Adorno argues for immanent critique, critiquing society from within its own standards and contradictions, but insists that this cannot be an immanent critique that is not at the same time demanding social change. He focuses on the incompatibility of claim and criterion, where society's ideals clash with its reality, but warns against affirming any easy reconciliation in abstraction from the real accompanying social conditions. True reconciliation requires social transformation, not just philosophical insight.
It's a demanding view. This brings us back to that question. Do you believe certain aspects of human experience, like aesthetic appreciation, profound emotion, maybe even religious feeling, are fundamentally beyond full conceptual or scientific explanation? And what does this imply for how we seek understanding in our lives? It's a question that the idealists and their contemporary inheritors like Adorno wrestled with deeply. Hashtag outro. Well, we've certainly explored the rich and sometimes challenging tapestry of German idealism today. It's a philosophical tradition that really boldly asserts the formative power of mind, of spirit, often standing in stark contrast to those naturalistic views that seek to reduce everything to the physical world.
Stark contrast is right.
We've seen how concepts like Kant's synthetic a priori, Fichte's intersubjective summons, Hegel's evolving spirit how they offered these profound ways to understand knowledge, freedom, and maybe even the very structure of reality itself.
And the debates ignited by these thinkers are just far from settled, aren't they? The nature of normativity, where do oughts come from? The sources of moral authority, individual conscience, or social reason? That balance between individual autonomy and our social constitution.
And the irreducible significance of values.
Exactly. These are questions contemporary philosophers continue to wrestle with, finding in German idealism both, deep inspiration, but also some crucial challenges to current paradigms, especially those that try to explain everything through a purely scientific lens.
So this deep dive has hopefully illuminated some of the fundamental philosophical commitments at play and how we all try to understand the world. It really invites you to consider how these profound ideas resonate with your own experience and beliefs. Do you find yourself leaning towards finding ultimate explanations in the hard, natural facts?
Or do you find something in human consciousness, in our social life, in art, that suggests a reality, or at least dimensions of reality, that go beyond purely empirical reduction?
The puzzle here, as one of our sources suggested, the puzzle which contemporary naturalism cannot really be said to have engaged with, it still remains, doesn't it? How do we truly measure our value needs? What kind of understanding can truly satisfy us as human beings?
That's the enduring question. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into this fascinating interplay of mind, nature, and meaning.